11 days. That was the number printed on the paper taped to my front door under the words Notice of Trustee Sale, above my own address, below a case number I could have recited in my sleep. My house. The house I had 11 payments left on out of 360 was going to be auctioned on the courthouse steps in 11 days. And the debt that started the whole machine was $340. For paint. A shade of gray on my own front door that the architectural committee had decided, after the fact, was not on the approved list. My name is Dan Kovac. I was 49 that spring, and for 20 years I cleaned up files exactly like this one for title companies and mortgage loss mitigation desks, which is the part they never checked before they mailed a foreclosure to the one man in Brookhaven Trace who reads these things for a living. I stood on my porch and I did not panic, because panic is what the clock is designed to produce, and I had spent 2 decades watching that clock eat people who panicked.
Instead, I took out my phone and I photographed the notice, and the envelope, and the postmark, and the date, the way I have photographed every single piece of certified mail that has crossed my hands since 2006. Then I turned the notice over, saw the law firm on the signature block, Harmon and Pyle, and I actually laughed once, out loud, on my own porch. I knew that firm. They did not know me. Let me tell you how $340 becomes a trustee's sale, because the mechanism is the whole story. It starts with a fine you didn't earn. Maureen Slate, the 58-year-old president of our homeowners association, ran Brookhaven Trace like a woman who mistook a volunteer board seat for a throne. And after I'd stood up at a meeting and pointed out that her beautification assessment had never been properly voted, she found her paint. I disputed the fine in writing, politely, with a photograph of the approved color sheet that included my exact shade. I got silence. What I did not know then, but knew cold within a day of reading my own file, was that silence was the product. Because the association's management company, Keystone Community Group, did not actually want my $340. They wanted the machine that turns $340 into thousands. Keystone handed my delinquency to Harmon and Pyle, a law firm that does not practice law so much as operate a foreclosure conveyor, and the moment they touched it, my paint fines started breeding. A demand fee, a processing fee, a title review fee, a lien preparation fee. By the time it reached my door as a trustee's sale, my $340 in fines had grown a body of over $9,000 in fees, 96% of which existed to be charged and nothing else. So on day 11, I stopped being a homeowner and started being what I used to be for a paycheck. I pulled my own file at the county recorder's office, and I read it the way I'd read 10,000 others, and it was, professionally speaking, garbage. The association's super priority lien had been recorded and calculated wrong, sweeping in fees that a super lien has no statutory business securing. The notice of default had gone out to an address the recorder's own records didn't match. The statutory cure period, the window the law gives you to fix a default before they can accelerate to sale, had been shorted by weeks, not days. Any one of those defects was a crack. Together, they were a hole you could drive a truck through. And I had a box in my garage, my old work box, full of the templates and checklists I'd used for 2 decades, including the ugly little pattern of a mill foreclosure, the same recycled paragraphs, the same fee schedule, the same trustee. I recognized my own file because I had cleaned up 100 that looked exactly like it. That recognition is the thing that turned my stomach and then turned my day. Because if my file was a template, then there were others. A lot of others. I tried the front door first, because you always try the front door first, and because a clean record of them refusing the reasonable thing is worth more later than any argument. I sent Harmon and Pyle a formal debt validation demand under the federal Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. A firm collecting association dues is a debt collector, whether it likes the word or not. And I drafted it perfectly, every I dotted, demanding they itemize and substantiate every fee. This was the trap, and they walked into it half asleep. A firm that actually had the paper would have sent the paper. Instead, on day 9, their conveyor spit back a boilerplate brush-off, a form letter that didn't validate a single fee and instead simply reaffirmed the sale date, which is precisely the thing the law forbids a debt collector from doing while validation is pending. Their own reflexive letter, generated by a machine that had never once been challenged by someone who knew the rules, was an admission. I photographed it, dated it, and put it in the file next to everything else. The conveyor had just handed me its own confession, and it didn't even slow down to notice. Then I went to the meeting, because a thing this public deserved to be answered in public, and because I wanted Maureen's slate on the record. On day 8, I stood up in the Brookhaven Trace clubhouse in front of 60 of my neighbors, and I laid the defects out plainly. The shorted cure period, the miscalculated super lien, the fees that couldn't be secured, a family's house on the block for a can of paint. Maureen didn't blink. She leaned into the microphone and told the room I was a chronic delinquent embarrassing this community, which is a bold thing to call a man over $340 disputed dollars, and it was then that Todd Allister, the Keystone manager sitting beside her with his laptop and his lanyard, made the mistake that would end all of them. Annoyed, certain he was untouchable, he said out loud that collections are our strongest revenue line, and we're not going to apologize for enforcing the rules. Revenue line. He'd just called my house a revenue line into a room, and the little recorder in my shirt pocket, running with the notice at the door that I record, because I follow the law even when they don't, caught every word of it. Maureen signaled 2 men in HOA security polos to walk me out, and they came fast and stood too close. And I want to be clear that I didn't give them the scene they wanted. I picked up my folder, told the room the sale date and the case number so every neighbor could write it down, and I walked out on my own with the most valuable 8 seconds of audio I would ever own sitting in my pocket. That was the night it stopped being my fight. That was the night I understood it was a business model, and I was just one line on a spreadsheet. Day 6 is when I stopped the clock. I had spent 2 nights building it, and I filed for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction to halt the trustee's sale. And this is where 20 years of doing the boring work paid the whole debt at once. Because I didn't argue that the fine was unfair, courts don't care what's unfair, they care what's defective. I argued the defects, and I proved them with paper. My photographs established that the notice of default reached me weeks late, after the cure window had supposedly already closed, which is not a technicality but a due process failure that voids the acceleration. The recorder's records showed the super lien swept in fees it couldn't legally secure, and their own FDCPA brush-off letter proved they'd pressed the sale while validation was pending. The judge read it, looked up, and stopped the sale. 11 days had become a live case with the auction frozen, and the machine, which had never had a file fight back, did the thing over-leveraged machines do when you jam them. It lashed out. Harmon and Pyle fired off a threat to seek their costs and fees against me personally for my frivolous interference, a letter meant to scare a homeowner back into his hole. What it actually told me was that Craig Pyle had no idea I was already 3 levels into his portfolio, and that a scared man and a man who has just been handed a motive to dig look identical right up until the digging starts. Because here is what a public county recorder is. It is a filing cabinet that cannot lie and cannot be told to stop talking. On day 5, I searched it the way I know how, by trustee, by firm, by recycled instrument language, and Harmon and Pyle bloomed across the results like mold. Hundreds of them. The same notice of default, the same fee schedule, the same shorted cure periods, the same super lean math, filed against home after home after home across 3 counties, each one a family who had gotten a paint fine or a trash can fine or a mailbox fine and then met the conveyor. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a sample. And then the machine did the one thing machines like this can't survive, which is that a human being inside it decided she couldn't stomach it anymore. A woman who had worked the Harmon and Pyle foreclosure desk, who had signed more eviction packets than she could sleep next to, reached out through a mutual contact and handed me the inside of the thing. The internal playbook that literally described HOA foreclosures as a recurring revenue product, the fee generation scripts, and a working list of hundreds of target homes. She was done being a cog, and she gave me the schematic of the machine. With her documents, the public record, and Alistair's revenue line on tape, I stopped defending one house and started building a class action, a state bar grievance against the firm, and a complaint to the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. On day 4, the machine sent its own lawyer to frighten me in person, which is how I knew it was rattled. Craig Pyle called me directly, not a paralegal, not the conveyor, Pyle himself. And I answered with the same sentence I'd given the notice on my door. This call is being recorded. He talked anyway, because men like Pyle cannot picture a homeowner who isn't afraid. And over 11 expensive minutes, he explained that I was in over my head, that fighting would only run the fees higher, and that he would personally see to it that I paid for every hour of his firm's time. He meant it as a threat. On tape, to a man quietly assembling a bar grievance, it was a demonstration, a lawyer wielding the cost of his own defective process as a club, which is its own kind of violation. I thanked him for his time. Meanwhile, Maureen worked the other jaw of the pincer, and Brookhaven Trace mailed me a brand new citation, a $100 fine for maintaining an unapproved recording device visible from common areas. Which is to say, they were now fining me for the camera I'd mounted after they came for my house. I almost admired the nerve. I photographed it, dated it, and filed it. Because in a retaliation case, a board that punishes you for documenting it isn't escalating, it's testifying. 2 more exhibits in 2 days, each one hand-delivered by someone who still believed the man on the other end would flinch. They tried to buy the silence, of course, the way these operations always do when the paperwork turns against them. On day 3, Keystone's lawyer floated an offer. They'd rescind the sale, waive the $340, wipe every fee, walk away clean, if I signed a confidentiality agreement and dropped everything else. 6 months earlier, that would have been a miracle. Now, it was just a confession with a bow on it, and I said no, on the record, in writing, because a man who tries to buy your silence is a man who knows exactly what you'd say out loud. And I did one more thing before the end, because I wanted the whole county to see the door I held open. I offered Maureen Slate and the board a clean, lawful exit, in a letter I made sure was read at the next meeting. Rescind the foreclosure, treat the $340 as genuinely disputed, and run an honest process, and this ends tonight. Maureen refused it, in front of 40 of her own neighbors, and, unluckily for her, a phone that was recording, declaring that this association does not negotiate with people who don't pay. She had just chosen the auction over the settlement, on camera, which is the exact difference between a woman who made a mistake and a woman who knowingly tried to sell a family's home for spite. Day 0. Because a trustee's sale is a scheduled event with its own dumb momentum, and because somebody at Harmon and Pyle either missed the injunction or gambled I wouldn't show, the trustee actually stood on the courthouse steps that morning to cry, "My house for sale." I was already there. So was a reporter I'd walked the whole file through the night before, and so were 9 of the neighbors whose case numbers I'd read into that clubhouse microphone. When the trustee opened the sale, I stepped up with a certified copy of the injunction in one hand, and I read it out loud. And then I kept reading. The shorted cure period, the miscalculated super lien, the fabricated fees. Todd Alistair's recorded voice calling a family's home a revenue line, and the count of how many other families on those same steps had been run through the identical template. The trustee had no choice but to announce the sale rescinded, on the record, in front of the camera, and the sound a foreclosure machine makes when it seizes in public is a very quiet one. The story ran that night. By the end of the week, the State Bar had opened a disciplinary investigation into Harmon and Pyle, and the Attorney General's office had opened its own. It came apart fast after that, the way these things do once the record turns and the money gets scared. My wrongful foreclosure claim settled for a number I'm not allowed to print, but am very content with. Harmon and Pyle, the conveyor that had never lost a file because no file had ever fought, collapsed under the bar discipline and the Attorney General's inquiry, its recurring revenue product laid out in its own internal words. Keystone Community Group lost the Brookhaven Trace contract and most of its portfolio within a quarter, because it turns out management companies are only valuable until the collections desk becomes a headline. Maureen Slate and her block resigned before the recall vote could reach them, and the class action swept up hundreds of those recorder filings. Families who'd been run off their own steps got their sales unwound and their fees returned. And a machine that had eaten homes across 3 counties for paint and trash cans and mailboxes stopped running. I paid the $340 in the end, under written protest on principle, the same day the whole apparatus that had tried to take my house for it ceased to exist. It was, I have to admit, the best $340 I ever spent. Author's note: stepping in as myself for a minute, because this one isn't really about a fine. It's about what happens when a nuisance charge stops being a rule and becomes a product. The Tell and Dan story is Todd Allister's phrase, "our strongest revenue line," because it reveals the actual design. The fine was never meant to be paid. It was meant to metastasize. Once collections are a profit center, the shorted cure period and the padded fees aren't sloppiness, they're the business plan. That's why the machine kept accelerating past every off-ramp Dan offered. It literally could not afford to stop. What sank them was arrogance mistaken for immunity. They ran a template on a man who wrote templates for a living, and they left their fingerprints in the one place that never forgets, the public recorder, where a single searchable pattern turned one house into a class. His camera roll of postmarks, that FDCPA brush-off they reflexively mailed, the recording in his pocket, none of it was exotic. It was just documentation, kept by a man who assumed nobody would. So keep the receipts nobody asks you for, read the notice instead of fearing it, and know that a debt collector who won't validate a debt has already told you it can't. Question for you: if your board could foreclose over a paint color, is your HOA protecting your property or renting out the power to take it? Tell me below.